This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Lo Kui-su. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. Singapore's Senior Minister Lee Jae-myung marks 30 years of an intergovernmental project with Beijing, saying he sees the Suzhou Industrial Park playing a crucial role in China's economic growth. The man heading UN talks for a treaty to tackle plastic pollution says he sees success as discussions enter their final round in South Korea. South Korea's main opposition leader cleared of perjury charges, but Lee Jae-myung still facing a string of other legal challenges that could take him out of contention for presidential polls in 2027. Taiwan reports the first Chinese balloon since April, with officials saying it was sighted in the northwest, along with PLA aircraft and Navy warships. Taiwan's baseball team scores an historic victory, beating favourites Japan at an international championship. The island promising a fighter jet escort to give the team a hero's welcome later tonight. Singapore and China have inked a new agreement charting the way forward for the Suzhou Industrial Park in the next decade. The first government-to-government project between the two nations, marking its 30th anniversary. Singapore Senior Minister Lee Jae-myung spoke at a commemorative event today in Suzhou, saying the park will continue to be a significant part of bilateral cooperation moving forward. Mr. Lee met Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng earlier today in Suzhou as part of a 6-day visit to China. Mr. Lee said he looks forward to the Suzhou Industrial Park playing an active and useful role in China's current advanced state of economic development. He noted that what began as an ambitious and promising project has now matured into a highly successful example. Vice Premier He remarked that the Suzhou Industrial Park has experienced tremendous transformations over the past 30 years, becoming a benchmark for China's opening up to the world. And for more, joining us live from the Suzhou Industrial Park is our China correspondent, Olivia Shung. Olivia, Suzhou Industrial Park marking 30 years there in a very big way. Why is this park so very significant?
Wei Su, you said it just earlier, the Suzhou Industrial Park being Singapore and China's first government-to-government project, also seen as paving the way for two other such projects, namely in Tianjin and Chongqing, that we've seen in the decades after. We wanted to come to you live from actually the waterfront over here, where you'll be able to see just how vibrant this place is with its tall skyscrapers and modern iconic buildings. But the weather is not being very kind to us today, but still talking to residents who have lived here for a long time, they say that the transformation that has been seen in the last 30 years has been very obvious. And to mark the milestone, we saw Singapore's Senior Minister Lee Jae-myung and Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng attend a whole series of commemorative events today, speaking at a round table attended by over 200 government and business leaders. We saw Mr. Lee point out that he had been personally involved in the very early days of the Suzhou Industrial Park. And while he did mention that there were some differences between Singapore and China along the way, that both sides, however, were able to work together in good faith to resolve them, also noting that the project has benefited both sides greatly. Now, looking ahead to what all this means beyond this 30-year milestone, Mr. Lee noted that China is facing very different challenges today compared to when it first started its reform and opening up journey. Now, if you recall back to the 1980s, China saw rapid economic growth, but today we know it's facing slowing growth and greater uncertainties from the external environment. But Mr. Lee stressed that it would be unwise and short-sighted to write off China. Have a listen.
Singapore continues to have confidence in China's future. We believe that a growing and prospering China can and should play a major constructive role internationally, contributing to the prosperity and well-being of other countries and a stable international order where all countries, big and small, coexist peacefully together.
Now, also speaking at the event was the Chinese Vice Premier, He Lifeng, and he outlined his expectations for the industrial park moving forward. He did say that moving forward, the park should be a demonstration park for high-quality development, also setting an example for bilateral cooperation. Another thing he mentioned also is that the park should strive to be a globally competitive ecosystem for innovation and opening up, expressing confidence as well in China's economy, saying that it has been generally stable and that the latest stimulus measures that have been introduced by the government to boost the economy are starting to see effect. Now, this comes as we know China has been trying to address its weaker than expected post-pandemic recovery with major drags in its property sector and weak domestic demand. But here's what the Vice Premier had to say.
以苏州为代表的大中小城市，以江苏为代表的中国各个省区市，营商环境、创新环境和生活环境正在越来越好。我们热诚欢迎新加坡以及各国的企业继续投资中国，共享发展的新机遇。我们坚信，在中新双方的共同努力下，未来的30年，苏州工业园区必将取得新的更大的成就。
Oh, Olivia, you wouldn't be able to see this, but we saw this as you were speaking to us, the rolling footage of Mr. Lee's visit to the Suzhou Industrial Park, and we can see the transformation there. Now, this new deal, looking forward to the next decade, what sort of development will we be seeing, at least as part of this particular deal?
Wei Su, what we do know is that the Suzhou Industrial Park in the last 30 years already has a reputation of being one of the most competitive development zones within China. But now officials are saying that with this new blueprint, what they want to do is to take things further, to turn this place into a world-class, innovative development zone. Now, Singapore and China today signed that new agreement that they've been working on for some time. And this is a blueprint that charts the way forward for the next decade up till 2033. The plan is, they say, to grow emerging markets here in the emerging sectors, rather, within the zone, for example, in green development, the digital economy, as well as in biomedical sciences. Here's Senior Minister Lee again.
SIP's model will be a reference and an inspiration for other tech and industrial parks across the country. It will also demonstrate China's continuing openness to the world and its desire to welcome investors. In an era of uncertainty and anxiety, it will be a beacon of cooperation and hope.
Now, one of the new developments that's coming up in 2026 is a new life sciences biomedical park. What it is a partnership between SIP and Singapore state investor Temasek, and with the goal to drive innovations in areas like medical drug development and AI-driven medical technologies. Another new development that's coming up and set to launch in 2027 is a green digital hub that will have mostly spaces for research and development, as well as offices to support businesses in setting up here, both Singaporean and Chinese companies as well. And Mr. Lee did say that all this will help Suzhou Industrial Park to remain relevant and also be able to draw investment from at home and abroad. Wei Su.
Oh, thanks. That's CNA's Olivia Shung live from Suzhou there. Of course, Olivia looking at 30 years of a key project between Singapore and China. South Korea is hosting negotiations to create the world's first ever treaty to end plastic pollution. The chair of the intergovernmental talks is urging countries to transcend their differences.
Let us harness every tool of multilateralism, every ounce of creativity, and every moment of dialogue to overcome our differences and craft a treaty as ambitious as our collective will allows.
Many Asian, African and European nations want discussions that tackle the entire life cycle of plastics, from limiting production to redesigning products to facilitating reuse and recycling. But oil producers such as Saudi Arabia and Russia want to just focus on managing plastic waste. Any agreement will need the backing of both the United States and China. The UN says the world is producing 430 million tons of plastic every year on average. That is expected to triple by 2060. More than 90% of plastic is not recycled, with about 20 million tons polluting the environment every year. Host country South Korea is getting praise for being one of the best recycling economies in the world. It's the only Asian country to have made it to the top 10 of MIT Technology Review's Green Future Index in 2022. South Korea claims to recycle 73% of its plastic waste, but a Reuters report says more than 90% of that gets dumped or incinerated. Inger Anderson, the executive director of the United Nations Environment Programme, says there is pressure on negotiators to deliver curbs on plastic pollution.
People want a pathway towards solutions. They know, I'm sure, that this is not going to be solved in a day. And they know that the text of a treaty, once agreed, is not going to fix the plastic on their beaches. But they want a stake in the ground that allows us to move forward. Let me just say that it took us 21 years, COP21, to get to agree that we have to be less than 2 degrees and aiming for 1.5. We don't have 21 years for this. People want answers, and they want it now. So it's precisely within the hands of member states to get us there. And of course, when we look at the broader world that are suffering from plastic pollution, Africa, Asia, Latin America, etc., this gives a certain buoyancy to the hopefulness as we step into the final round of these talks. We absolutely want to address the sustainable dimension of production and consumption, which means having a laser focus, of course, on the entire life cycle, but very much also on that which is single-use and short-lived plastics.
And why it's a matter of existential urgency that the world does get that binding treaty on plastic pollution. We're speaking with Hernandez later this hour on East Asia Tonight to ask him that. He's a global coordinator from the Break Free from Plastic movement, speaking from Manila. China slammed Taiwan after the island said it detected a Chinese balloon over its northern waters. A similar incident was flagged 7 months ago, a move that it views as harassment by Beijing. Beijing has denounced Taipei's claims, saying the island does not have a defense ministry to begin with. It also describes the question posed by journalists on the situation as, quote, undiplomatic. Taiwanese authorities say a single balloon was spotted floating close to Keelung port yesterday evening. It then vanished some 2 hours later after flying at an altitude of 10,000 meters, but without crossing into the island. China previously dismissed Taiwan's complaints about the balloons, saying they were for meteorological purposes and should not be hyped up for political reasons. China stepped up its military pressure on Taiwan as part of the so-called grey zone warfare. Tensions have intensified since Taiwanese President William Lai took office early this year. Mr. Lai has vowed to uphold Taiwan's rights to independence, even as mainland China maintains the island is part of its territory. Still on East Asia Tonight, Uniqlo parent snubs calls to exit China, saying the country's textile industry remains crucial for the fashion retailer. China's Huawei, blacklisted by the US, gearing up to launch its first flagship phone, able to run on its own operating system. Our business news is next with Olivia Marzuki. Olivia, China keeping its policy loan rate unchanged.
That's right, Wei Su. No surprise there, as the Chinese central bank keeps a watch on policy moves, and it is from the White House before ramping up monetary stimulus. The People's Bank of China, or PBOC, has kept its one-year policy loan unchanged at 2% for a second consecutive month. Monetary authorities are staying cautious about ramping up monetary stimulus, but While it held the medium-term lending rate steady, the PBOC injected more cash into the banking system to support credit flow. About 900 billion yuan, or more than 124 billion US dollars of liquidity was added into the system. Analysts say that the cash injection may help ease liquidity pressures as local governments increase their bond issuance. And Greater China markets close lower today. Investor focus this week will also be centered on China's industrial profit data out on Wednesday to gauge domestic demand. A looming trade war and elevated geopolitical tensions also sapping already fading risk appetite as we see across the board. It's red for Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Hang Seng. Uniqlo parent Fast Retailing is standing firm on its commitment to China despite growing calls from global companies to reduce dependence on the country, and that comes amid economic stagnation and rising geopolitical tensions. CEO Tadashi Yanai insists that China remains crucial to Fast Retailing's operations, with more than half of its garment factories based there. Mr. Yanai points out that Chinese factories provide both high-quality and mass-scale production, something hard to replicate elsewhere without significant investment. Now, other companies worldwide are adopting a China Plus One strategy by diversifying into countries such as Vietnam and India. But Mr. Yanai argues that China's manufacturing capabilities are not easy to replace. Despite challenges like rising wages and foreign investment deficits in China, Fast Retailing continues to expand its presence, and this includes closing underperforming stores while opening up larger, better located ones. For Fast Retailing, China remains vital, accounting for 22% of its revenue, second only to Japan. Now, the company's next goal is close to $65 billion in sales, with continued international growth, especially in Europe and North America. Japanese railway operators rallied today. The surprise boost coming from reports that a fund linked to activist investor Yoshiaki Murakami has built stakes in Keisei Electric Railway and Keikyu. Keisei's stock jumped 18%, its biggest rise since 2008, while Keikyu climbed more than 16%, the highest since 1987. Now, according to sources, Murakami's fund holds almost 5% of Keikyu and less than 1% of Keisei. Other rail stocks, including Odakyu Electric in central Japan, also gained on those news. Murakami's funds are part of a growing number of activist investors working to unlock value in undervalued Japanese companies. Analysts expect Murakami may push Keisei to sell 19% stake in theme park operator Oriental Land, whose shares rose around 5% after the news broke earlier today. The surge in rail stocks comes amid the broader trend of activist investment in Japan following similar moves in companies like Tokyo Gas and Kobayashi Pharmaceutical. Despite the sharp rise, some analysts caution against expecting long-term gains, calling it a knee-jerk reaction. China's Huawei is set to launch its first flagship phone that can run its own app on a fully homegrown operating system. It is offering an alternative to Apple's iOS and Google's Android, despite U.S. sanctions around the company. The Mate 70 smartphone will be released tomorrow with its Harmony OS Next platform. This platform was launched 5 years ago after U.S. sanctions cut off support for Google's Android. Huawei hopes to establish it as a third major mobile operating system alongside Apple's iOS and Google's Android. It is aiming to offer 100,000 applications on the system in the next 6 to 12 months. The software launch builds on hardware momentum from last year, when the group unveiled the Mate 60, powered by a self-developed and locally made processor capable of near 5G speeds. It also comes amid a goal to achieve self-reliance as U.S. and China look to establish their own ecosystem in the tech space. Last month, Huawei reported sales jumping 30% from a year ago for the first 9 months of 2024. Delegates from across the globe are in Saudi Arabia's capital, Riyadh, for the World Investment Conference. They're talking about how to scale up investment opportunities by harnessing digital transformation and sustainable growth. Early on, I spoke with Victor Chu. He's the head of First Eastern Investment Group, and I started by asking him about investment risks and opportunities for Asia, given the current geopolitical landscape, especially with Donald Trump returning as U.S. president.
I think with this part of the world, the Trump 2.0 is more of an opportunity than a threat, because I think the China plus one strategy will be a lot more evident, and there will be a lot more supply chain centers and hubs being established and invested in Asia and in the Gulf. I think in terms of the protectionism and the threat of the Trump 2.0, Asia and the Gulf is really more of an oasis. We are not really on the frontier of those challenges. China itself will also be investing a lot more outwardly in order to establish secondary or third supply chain centers. So in both ways, I think Asia and the Gulf should be a strategic beneficiary of a Trump 2.0.
Let's talk about the current state of China's economy. All eyes are fixed now on whether or not this year's GDP target of around 5% is achievable. What is your take on it?
Yes, I think whether it's 5 or 4, we have to understand this is on the back of a 40 years of spectacular economic growth of 9% compound. So when you have a 9% compound for 40 years, the cake is much bigger than 30, 40 years ago. So even at 5%, we're talking about over 35% share of the global economic growth. So whatever it is, provided it is a real positive growth, it will make a real contribution to the world economy.
Well, I'd also like to ask your thoughts on the Hong Kong economy. We know that tourism has somewhat rebounded since COVID, but still, consumption and retail spending have not fully recovered. Meanwhile, the IPO market's drying up and the capital flight still remains a challenge. We know that Chief Executive John Lee has promised a reform to revive Hong Kong's economy and financial status. But how soon do you think Hong Kong can get its mojo back?
Yes, I think Hong Kong is going through some fundamental challenges. We need to refine our industrial base and our economic growth model. There's nothing wrong of our existing model. We need to broaden our base and do it more strategically with patience, confidence, but with humility. I just give you a few figures to demonstrate that Hong Kong is back, albeit gradually. Hong Kong International Airport is still the #1 airport in terms of cargo throughput in the world for the last few years. And we are now operating over 1,000 flights a day. And the third runway has just opened. Hong Kong's banking system is extremely robust. The bank deposit is now $250 billion, which record a 13% increase over the last 2 years. And the wealth management industry now stands at $4 trillion which is a 30% more than pre-COVID. So if you look at the real figures and the fundamental, Hong Kong is rock solid. But obviously, as I mentioned, we're good, but we need to do better in order to face off some of the difficult geopolitical challenges, but also some macroeconomic challenges from technology, from supply chain disruption, and also the fact that many parts of the world, their economic growth is still fragile. We in Asia are okay, but there are many parts of the world that needs a lot more direct investment to boost up their base. So Hong Kong, together with our ASEAN partners, will be able to play a very good role as a connector and an interlocutor for investment into and out of Greater China. And as I mentioned, even if China grows at 5% or 4.5%, it represents more than 30% of global economic growth.
Well, let's take a quick look at the rest of East Asia markets at the start of a new trading week. Japan's Nikkei 225 ended higher as local investors found comfort from the recent U.S. data that signaled strong business activity in the world's largest economy. South Korea's Kospi also gained as investors welcome Donald Trump's nomination of Scott Bessent as U.S. Treasury Secretary, viewing it as a more likely move to bring more stability into the financial markets. And Taiwan's benchmark also ended the day in the green. Wei Su. That's all I have in business for you.
Well, thanks, Olivia. And still ahead on East Asia tonight, we return to one of our top stories. Delegates in South Korea to hammer out the first ever global treaty on tackling plastic pollution. We ask an expert what we can expect given the enormous vested interests that are standing in the way of any ambitious agreement. Singapore's Senior Minister Lee Jae-myung marks 30 years of an intergovernmental project with Beijing, saying he sees the Suzhou Industrial Park playing a crucial role in China's economic growth. The man heading UN talk for a treaty to tackle plastic pollution says he sees success as discussions enter their final round in South Korea. Our Taiwan reports the first Chinese balloon since April, with officials saying it was sighted in the northwest, along with Chinese aircraft and Navy warships. Mixed reactions to a climate deal struck on funding following extended talks at COP29 over the weekend. The EU and the US hailing that deal, while the UN's climate chief said it would keep up the growth in the boom in clean energy. But developing and poorer countries most vulnerable to the climate crisis are up in arms. They say the $300 billion agreement was far from sufficient. The frustration prompted some developing and island nations to walk out of that meeting. India led the criticism, blasting both the COP29 presidency and host Azerbaijan.
We had informed the Secretariat that we wanted to make a statement prior to any decision on the adoption. However, and this is for everyone to see, this has been stage managed. And we are extremely, extremely disappointed with this incident.
We accepted the text because we could not leave Baku without a text, but we're not satisfied whatsoever.
The agreement on climate finance marks an increase of $200 billion from the previous deal. But developing nations wanted as much as $1.3 trillion. The deal also failed to set detailed steps for how countries are to act on last year's climate summit pledge in the transition from fossil fuels to triple their use of renewable energy this decade. South Korea, meanwhile, is hosting the final round of UN negotiations to create the world's first ever treaty to end plastic pollution. The chair of the intergovernmental talks is urging countries to transcend their differences. Ahead of those talks, climate activists on Sunday gathered at the beaches of the host city of Busan, holding up signs reading "No Plastic." The demonstrators from around the world uniting in a single call for a global commitment to fight plastic waste.
I'm from Australia. We have a big plastic problem in Australia, like all around the world. We know that fossil fuel companies are responsible for the plastic crisis, but together with people power, we need binding regulation to hold them accountable. It's very important that we reduce plastic production, that we stop the dirty waste trade, and that we scale up reuse solutions.
And rallies also taking place close to the Busan Exhibition and Convention Center, where discussions are being held.
각국 대표단에 시민들 목소리를 전달하기 위해서 오늘 행진을 준비했고요. 저희는 생산부터 규제하는 플라스틱 전 주기를 규제하고 법적 구속력이 있고 전 세계가 공통으로 지킬 수 있는 목표가 포함된 협약을 요구하고 있습니다.
And for more, we're joined by Mr. Von Hernandez. He is Global Coordinator at Break Free from Plastic. Now, it's a movement that envisions a future without plastic pollution. He's speaking to us from Manila. Mr. Hernandez, we just heard there from a demonstrator in Busan saying the need is there for a binding treaty to stop plastic pollution. But given talks ongoing, now the language we have seen, the absence of any targeting of plastic production, and the absence of any provision for a legally enforceable mandatory treaty. What's the point of any extra success, even if countries reach an agreement on tackling plastic pollution?
Thank you, and good evening. We are hopeful that this fifth and final round of negotiations to negotiate an agreement to end plastic pollution would still result in a fairly high ambition. Meaning to say that the resulting agreement would focus on all aspects of plastics life cycle, not just looking at it as a waste management issue, but also looking at all the stages from extraction to production all the way to disposal. So in order for this to be considered a successful meeting, we need to see action and agreements targeting production. We need production caps. There's just simply an oversupply of plastics that's polluting and harming the environment, and it's contributing to what we consider to be the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and toxic
Mr.
pollution.
Hernandez, if we look at just the results of talks on climate funding at COP29, I take it a vested interest got in the way of any deal being reached there. Now, on plastics, fossil fuel heavily dependent countries, they're likely to block anything, as they did in Ottawa earlier this year, on any inclusion on upstream production of plastics. If they blocked it in Ottawa, are they not likely to block it again here?
That is the dynamic that we've seen so far in these negotiations. You have the fossil fuel countries, we call them petrostates, and they're the ones opposing any moves to include production caps or addressing plastic production as part of the needed solutions to address this crisis, and simply wanting to focus on waste management. Again, plastic pollution is not simply a waste management issue. But the good news is that there are a significant number of countries who call themselves High Ambition Coalition, and they want to see production cuts in the treaty. So this is the kind of debates that we want to see unfold in Busan this week.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of
sidetracking. And we're hoping that disappointing...
Please continue, please continue.
Sorry, no, we're just hoping that disappointing dynamic that we've seen so far in climate negotiations is not replicated in plastic treaty negotiations, although the vested interests, as you call them, are pretty much the same.
It's possible that we get taken off the key. So, for example, you were talking about how capping production is key to addressing even before we get to pollution. Now, the emphasis on fossil fuel dependent countries or big fossil fuel producers, they like to talk about circularity. So looking specifically at recycling and reusing, despite the fact that we know recycling, as far as plastics go, has not been, let's say, robust in the last 20 years. It is also not cost effective at all. And yet the emphasis continues to be on recycling.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, the solution here to reverse this crisis is really to cap production. Recycling, while it plays a role in the solution, it's not going to solve this problem. We've seen the track record of recycling over the last 70 years since plastics have, been deployed commercially in large scale. And even up to now, less than 10% of all plastics produced has actually ever been recycled, and not even effectively recycled at that. So we hope that the negotiating parties and member states will really address the root causes of the problem. In fact, overproduction of plastic is also undermining recycling itself, right? Because the price of virgin plastic polymers are simply so as quite cheap with oversupply, and recycled plastic cannot compete with that. So if we want to improve recycling, we need to address also overproduction.
And I think overproduction, there's a very big
one thing
picture.
I'd like to say.
Yes. Please continue very quickly.
Yes. One thing I'd like to say, because you mentioned the big picture and how this links to climate, the direction of travel globally is that many countries are trying to ramp up their efforts to decarbonize their energy and transport systems, moving away from fossil fuels. The thing is, the fossil fuel companies, or the industry and the petrochemical affiliates are wanting to ramp up plastic production as a way to hedge their bets against these trends to move away from fossil fuels. And ironically, if we allow this plastic production to continue, let's say, untrammeled and fettered in the next 3 decades, it will eat up the carbon budget and will still push us to catastrophic climate change. So this is the
final question here, Mr. Hernandez. Final question. Pardon me for cutting in. Essentially, the problem is a bit of a shapeshifter. So, for example, you say we decarbonize in one area, but then we ramp up plastic production in another. So for one country that thinks we are getting rid of our plastic waste is because they're exporting it to poorer countries that do not have the infrastructure to manage this volume of plastic waste, or we incinerate it and disappear the problem effectively. If we look at this, a global picture, looking at climate change, looking at pollution, looking at waste management, what do we need to see coming out of Busan? Final question.
A whole holistic approach would be really to set up ambitious targets, binding rules and agreements to eliminate the, let's say, most problematic, non-essential applications of plastic in the first instance. Then they have to look at how they can start freezing and reducing production of plastics. There needs also to be financing to enable developing countries in particular to build up their capacity to manage this problem. And that also means financing going to the right solutions, which is reuse and refill, repair, and not necessarily recycling. Recycling alone will not solve this problem. And we hope this is the kind of agreement that emerges from the talks in Busan.
And we shall see what those talks yield by the end of this week. Mr. Von Hernandez, Global Coordinator at Break Free from Plastic. Thanks for joining us this evening. South Korea and Malaysia have agreed to elevate ties to a strategic partnership after President Yoon Suk-yeol met Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim in Seoul. The two sides also signed an agreement to cooperate in supplying critical minerals from Malaysia's reserves and to deepen cooperation in the defense industry. South Korea hopes it can continue to help Malaysia replace its fighter jets. Also on the table, the finalization of a free trade agreement by next year and a climate change project scheduled for 2029. Both sides also sharing their concerns over North Korea's military ties with Russia and the ongoing humanitarian crisis in the Middle East. Ms. Anwar is on a 3-day visit to South Korea for the Malaysia-Korea Business Forum. We stay in South Korea, where a court has cleared opposition leader Lee Jae-myung of charges of influencing a witness to commit perjury. He was initially accused of getting his former mayoral secretary to provide false testimony in his favor. Lee is the leader of the main opposition Democratic Party of Korea. He has already received a suspended prison term for election violations. Prosecutors suspect the result was helped in part by the secretary's false testimony. Lee is facing 4 other trials, including for bribery and other charges, mostly tied to a $1 billion property development scandal. Lee was the Democratic Party's candidate for president in 2022. He lost then to Yoon Suk-yeol, but is still considered a major contender for the next presidential election in 2027. Should he be sentenced to a prison term and the ruling is upheld, Lee will lose his parliamentary seat and be barred from running for public office for at least 5 years after serving his term. Still ahead on this bulletin, CNA celebrates a momentous win in London as the channel makes its official debut in the UK. And we'll tell you what awaits the Taiwan baseball team when they return home from an historic win in Japan. CNA has been recognized for its excellence in broadcasting at a ceremony in London. It won 2 categories at this year's Association for International Broadcasting Awards for News Explainer and Investigative Documentary. John Beaver with this report.
For 2 decades, the AIB Awards have celebrated the best of international journalism. Coverage of the ongoing conflict in the Middle East dominated the awards. And CNA won the Best News Explainer category for Israel-Hamas, The Conflict Explained.
The Balfour Declaration was Britain's way of winning over the Jews.
The 8-part YouTube series aims to try and make sense of a hugely complex situation that's been decades in the making.
The Ottoman Turks were also involved in the war.
And CNA picked up the award in the sought-after investigative documentary category for Undercover Asia and its investigation of the tainted medicine scandal.
Dr. Bhavneet and her team soon find the culprit. All the children are believed to have consumed a syrup called Cold Best PC.
We're always there in terms of news coverage, but the role of documentaries is always to go in-depth into news stories. So we'll always be there to investigate the issues that need to be told and for the rest of the world to actually understand Asia.
A familiar face was hosting the awards, Ateli Edwards swapping the East Asia Tonight studio for the stage in London.
From Singapore to Sweden and almost everywhere in between, the world is well represented at this event. And this is the 20th anniversary of the awards that have become synonymous with broadcasting excellence.
Former Monty Python member turned traveller Michael Palin was honoured with a Lifetime Achievement Award, but the ceremony wasn't just about big names.
It's certainly one of our aims to showcase the extraordinary work that's going on from production companies, from broadcasters, large and small, in every part of the world. Everybody should be treated equally. Not everybody's got the same budgets, not everybody's got the same reach in terms of audiences, but they're all doing worthwhile storytelling.
After a night celebrating their achievements, it's back to the day job of trying to find those stories that matter most to audiences worldwide. John Beaver, CNA, London.
CNA is now available in 110 million homes worldwide after launching in the UK on the heels of debuting a service in the United States. Its award-winning news and current affairs programming has been added to the Freeview and Freely platforms, part of a global growth strategy aimed at helping audiences understand Asia. The UK launch was recently celebrated at a major event in London. Ollie Barrett takes us there.
CNA's new free ad-supported streaming television, otherwise known as FAST, is not only available to audiences in the United States already, but is now available in the UK too.
Launching CNA on the air in the UK. This event in central London marked an important moment, according to Singapore's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom.
CNA offers a nuanced, balanced and up-to-date coverage of developments in Asia, viewed through Asian lens. And Asia today houses many of the fastest growing and most dynamic economies in the world. And naturally, business and political leaders and decision makers in the UK and the rest of Europe would be interested to find out what's happening in Asia. And CNA's more in-depth analysis and reporting will help them make better and more informed decisions.
Award-winning CNA programming, now available to watch in the UK, showcased here in front of a large audience of diplomats, business people and other invited guests. From documentaries that explore the political and economic impact of US-China competition, to news bulletins that give viewers a deeper understanding of key economies in the Asia-Pacific.
Peter went through a very tough life when he was young.
The event also featured excerpts from The Exiles, which exposes the forced deportation of Asian men from post-war Britain and Australia and reveals the ramifications for their relatives. The 2023 documentary has been nominated for an International Emmy Award. CNA secured a broadcast licence from British regulator Ofcom, allowing it to expand to Freeview and Freely. It's also available on social TV platform Bolt Plus and from next year on smart TV platform Vida. All of this combined with CNA's new US offering means the channel's reach has grown to 110 million households worldwide. The aim is to help audiences everywhere understand Asia at a time of heightened geopolitical gyrations.
CNA has incredible programming, really understands compelling storytelling, and has clearly resonated very impactfully within their region. Now, what is important, I think, about taking it outside of Asia to the US and obviously here now today to UK audiences is about telling the Asian story from the Asian perspective, as we know that is invaluable and will offer incredible insight to people here in the UK.
The launch venue, the Singapore-owned Pan Pacific Hotel in London. And as well as those discussions about CNA's output and its UK launch, a strong culinary theme as well. A spread of Asian dishes, teas from across the continent and an array of spices. All examples of cultural exchange at a time when many consider that as important as ever.
You've got Europe at one level, you've got the United States another, and then Asia. I think we often quite find it difficult to get a perspective of how Asia's changing without being dominated by the China story. So from my perspective, getting something that's kind of sitting alongside China, a Southeast Asian perspective, the kind of perspective CNA can provide, is pretty essential right now.
And now CNA is available on UK platforms to do just that, at a time when Asia's importance is undeniable, with some saying the region will determine the future direction of the world. Ollie Barrett, CNA, London.
Well, turning to sports before we go, sumo wrestler Koto Zakura beat his opponent Hosho Ryu on Sunday to win his first ever Grand Sumo tournament with a 14 wins to 1 loss record. Koto Zakura comes from a family of elite wrestlers and is an Ozaki. That's the second highest rank in professional sumo. As he says, he's aiming for a promotion to Yokozuna as the top rank in the sport. That will require him to win the upcoming tournament or log an equivalent performance in the January tournament. If the 27-year-old manages that feat, he will earn his promotion, just as his Yokozuna grandfather did in 1973. Taiwan won its first ever gold in the World Baseball Softball Confederation Premier 12 event yesterday, upsetting defending champion Japan with a score 4-0. President William Lai has hailed the team for its strong performance with 4 fighter jets that escort them home as part of celebrations. The Japanese team arrived in the championship final as hot favorites with a perfect 9-0 record, and they beat Taiwan in both the group play and super round earlier. Cheers erupted at the Tokyo Dome yesterday when Taiwan put an end to Japan's winning streak of not having lost in 27 straight games. Taiwan got on the scoreboard thanks to Chia Cheng-lin's home run in the 5th and followed up by a Chia Hsie-chen 3-run homer in the same inning, with Captain Chen also earning MVP honors. More than 40,000 fans gathered to watch the two Asian powerhouses go head-to-head. Before last night's win, the island's best performance was a silver medal at the 1992 Barcelona Olympics.
这是我们第一次赢日本的一军球队，然后就是像在做梦一样，刚刚要哭了，谁会想到啊？
这非常的兴奋，因为台湾睽违23年都没有得到这么好的这个奖项。
強すぎてもうすごい素晴らしい。日本はもっと頑張んないと、あと応援ももっと頑張らないといけないなって。
And that's East Asia Tonight this Monday. Don't forget headlines anytime at cna.asia. Plus, we're on Facebook and YouTube.